The Arizona desert baked the Bravo 6 military training base under a merciless sun. Dust swirled around the edges of the training yard, catching the glare of the early morning light. Staff Sergeant Lisa Monroe adjusted her patrol cap, eyes scanning the recruits lined up in formation. She was small in stature, but every movement exuded authority. Her uniform, perfectly pressed despite the heat, reflected discipline. Every footstep she took echoed against the concrete with a rhythm that demanded attention. The men and women before her were the Army's future leaders, yet in this moment they were nothing more than students under her strict scrutiny. Lisa's voice cut through the arid air. Shoulder arms. Attention. Eyes forward. The recruits snapped into position, some more stiffly than others, their faces betraying both respect and nervousness. Among them, Corporal Dean Harris leaned back slightly, smirking. He was tall, broad-shouldered, the type of soldier who relied on charisma and brute force rather than discipline. Monroe had noticed him from the start, the arrogance in his stride, the way he glanced sideways at the female officers, as though challenging them silently. She walked the line slowly, inspecting each recruit with practiced precision. Her eyes were sharp, almost predatory, and the air seemed to tense around her. She stopped in front of Harris. "Corporal Harris," she said, her tone calm but icy, "you are out of line. Move your elbow back into position." Harris chuckled, a low, mocking sound. "Relax, Sergeant. It's just a drill," he said, leaning into her space, deliberately invading her personal zone. "You don't have to be so uptight." Monroe's gaze hardened. "I am not here for your comfort. I am here to enforce standards. If you cannot follow simple orders, you will be made an example." Harris snorted, and without warning, shoved past her as if testing her limits. Monroe's reflexes were instantaneous. She stepped to the side, hands raised in warning. But before she could stop him, Harris swung his rifle stock like a baseball bat, striking the side of her temple with a sharp crack. Pain exploded across her head, a sudden fire that made her vision swim. Time seemed to slow. Blood seeped through her hair and dripped onto her uniform. Some recruits gasped audibly, others froze, unsure whether to intervene. Harris laughed, a high, triumphant sound, and the air seemed to crackle with tension. Lisa's knees wobbled for a fraction of a second, but she didn't fall. She steadied herself, gripping the stock of Harris's rifle as he tried to pull it free. "You just ended your career," she whispered, voice low but lethal. Every eye in the yard was on her now, but none dared to speak. Even the sun seemed to pause, burning the scene into memory. The sudden roar of sirens shattered the moment. Military police vehicles poured onto the training ground, lights flashing and tires kicking up clouds of red dust. Orders were shouted over radios, crisp and commanding. Within seconds, the yard was a controlled chaos. Recruits were told to stay put, Harris was restrained, and Monroe was escorted to the infirmary. Colonel Raines arrived, his face pale with shock as he took in the blood on her uniform and the bruise forming on her temple. "Sergeant Monroe, are you?" he began, but she cut him off with a calmness that was almost unnerving. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the spinning fire behind her eyes. "But he is not." Harris sputtered, trying to explain himself, but his words were meaningless. The colonel's eyes narrowed. "You attacked a superior officer, Harris. That's assault." Harris tried to shrug, attempting a casual tone. "It was an accident. A misunderstanding." Monroe's glare stopped him cold. "You struck me deliberately. You humiliated the uniform and every person standing here. There will be consequences." Raines turned to the assembled recruits. "Lock down the base. All personnel confined to quarters. Radios on emergency channel." Headquarters, notify the Pentagon immediately. The words spread like wildfire. The atmosphere thickened, heavy with a mix of fear, awe, and disbelief. Some recruits muttered quietly to themselves, realizing for the first time that hierarchy and discipline were not just words, but something lethal if violated. Others watched Monroe as though she were some figure out of legend, a woman who could command authority in a world that often dismissed her. Monroe's eyes met Harris's. The arrogance in his face faltered, replaced by the first hint of fear. He had underestimated her, underestimated the very rules and people she represented. Within 20 minutes, 3 black SUVs rolled through the base's main gate, armored and intimidating, dust kicking up in their wake. Generals Barrett, Connors, and Harlan stepped out, each star glinting under the harsh desert sun. Their presence immediately imposed silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Barrett's eyes scanned the yard, locking on to Monroe. "Sergeant Monroe," he said, voice cold and precise. "Are you unharmed?" She nodded, blood streaking her uniform, hair matted against her temple. "I am fine, sir," she replied. Her voice was steady, commanding respect. The general's attention shifted to the yard. Barrett's gaze lingered on Harris, his smirk gone, replaced with visible panic. The man who had thought himself untouchable was suddenly powerless. Barrett's voice carried over the crowd, chilling in its authority. He knew nothing of the consequences. "He will." Monroe followed the generals into the infirmary, where a medic was already working to clean and stitch her wound. The room smelled of antiseptic, metal, and sweat. Each stitch felt like a small act of preparation, as if the wound itself symbolized the battle she had just begun. As the generals and Monroe reviewed the footage from security cameras across the base, the truth became undeniable. Harris had attacked deliberately, and the disrespect he displayed toward Monroe was symptomatic of a deeper cultural problem. Barrett's jaw tightened, his silence heavy with judgment. "She is here to enforce order," he said finally. And he just made it visible. Outside, the base was in lockdown. Military police patrolled every corridor. Recruits whispered, some wide-eyed, others avoiding eye contact. The desert heat pressed down, but the tension was more suffocating than the sun. Monroe sat quietly, absorbing the enormity of what had just occurred. She had faced physical violence, yet the real fight was only beginning. This incident was a spark, and the fire of accountability was about to spread. Harris, meanwhile, sat restrained, staring blankly, unable to comprehend that his world had changed in a matter of moments. The arrogance that had carried him so far evaporated in the presence of Monroe and the generals. He was no longer the predator. He was the lesson. Monroe's calm, her authority, and the sudden arrival of Generals Barrett, Connors, and Harlan transformed the base in a matter of minutes. From the outside, Bravo 6 looked like any other training base, harsh and disciplined. But inside, a storm was raging, one that would not be contained by walls, barbed wire, or military hierarchy. And in that moment, with the sun glaring overhead, the dust swirling around her boots, and the echoes of sirens fading into the distance, Monroe realized something essential. This was no longer about her. It was about every soldier who had ever been dismissed, underestimated, or humiliated. The fight had only begun, and she was at the center of it. The infirmary's air smelled of antiseptic, sweat, and something heavier, an invisible weight of accountability pressing down on everyone in the room. Staff Sergeant Lisa Monroe sat rigidly on the examination table, her uniform stained with blood, a ragged gash on her temple, glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. The medics worked quickly, cleaning the wound and applying sutures, but Monroe's focus wasn't on the pain. Her attention was locked on the man restrained nearby. Corporal Dean Harris's smugness had evaporated entirely. Now, panic flickered in his eyes, as he realized the severity of what he'd done. Colonel Rains stood beside Monroe, his posture tense. "Sergeant, are you?" he began, but Monroe cut him off, her voice calm yet razor-sharp. "I am fine, Colonel." But he is not. Harris's attempts to explain himself were futile. "It was an accident. A misunderstanding." "I didn't mean—" "You meant every word of it," Monroe replied evenly, her piercing gaze fixing him where he sat. "You struck a superior officer, deliberately, in front of witnesses. You humiliated the uniform. You disgraced every rule this base stands for. And now you will answer for it." The medic paused mid-stitch, glancing nervously at Monroe. Even here, in the sterile confines of the infirmary, her presence radiated authority. Harris's bravado was gone. The smirk that had carried him through basic training, through inspections, through countless drills, was replaced by a thin sheen of fear and disbelief. He had underestimated her, and underestimated the system she represented. Rains's phone buzzed. He answered, his face blanching as he listened. "Yes, sir, understood." He hung up, eyes widening. "They're coming," he said. "Generals Barrett, Connors, and Harlan are on their way. They've been briefed on the incident." Monroe's lips pressed into a thin line. The generals weren't here for pleasantries or small reprimands. When Barrett arrived, things would escalate, and not in Harris's favor. Within 20 minutes, the sound of black SUVs crunching over gravel announced their arrival. Dust billowed around the tires, sunlight glinting off the stars on their doors. Soldiers scattered to the windows, watching as the generals stepped out. Barrett was first, his eyes sharp, unreadable, scanning the yard as though reading every thought of the soldiers below. Monroe stood, still bleeding, still composed, as he approached. "Sergeant Monroe," Barrett said, his voice calm but cold, each word measured. "Are you unharmed?" Monroe nodded once, steady. "Yes, sir." Her blood-streaked uniform did nothing to diminish the authority she radiated. Barrett's gaze swept to Harris. The man, restrained by military police, shifted uneasily under the piercing stare. Barrett's voice dropped, ice cold. He knew nothing. He will. The implications were clear. Harris had walked straight into a storm he could not survive. Monroe followed the generals into a conference room, where screens displayed footage from cameras across the base. Every angle, every moment, every swing of Harris's rifle stock was captured. There was no ambiguity. Harris's assault had been deliberate, calculated, and completely reckless. Barrett's jaw tightened as he reviewed the footage. "This base tolerates misconduct," he said finally, breaking the tense silence. He just made it visible. Monroe watched silently, analyzing every nuance in the footage. She could see the recruits' reactions, the shock, the fear, the instant realization that the chain of command had been violated. For some, it was a lesson in authority. For others, a moment of clarity about who held power in this environment. Harris had failed to recognize it. "Half the men here have never respected women," Colonel Rains whispered, almost to himself. "Some pretend they do, but this changes everything." Barrett's gaze snapped to him. "Then we make an example loud enough for the entire army to hear," he said. "Effective immediately. Full lockdown. Every recruit confined to quarters. All equipment inspected. Phones, lockers, and personal effects monitored. Nobody leaves until I say so." Harris's eyes widened. "Wait. You can't?" Barrett cut him off with a single glance. "You don't decide anything. You acted recklessly. Now you will face consequences commensurate with your actions." Monroe's heart pounded, but her face betrayed nothing. For years, she had endured whispered jokes, subtle harassment, and the underestimation that came with being the only woman in a male-dominated environment. This moment, painful and public, was also vindication. It was the first time the system had moved decisively in her favor, and she would ensure it reached the right people. Outside the windows, soldiers lined the perimeter, their movements sharp and precise under the sudden tension. Whispers of what had happened spread quickly. For the first time, everyone understood that this was not a drill, not a training exercise, not an isolated incident. This was real and consequences were coming. Harris, meanwhile, sat frozen in the holding area, hands cuffed, every nerve screaming with anxiety. He had thought the worst that could happen was a reprimand, maybe a minor reduction in rank. Now the gravity of his situation hit him. He had attacked a federal inspector embedded in the army, a woman no one dared underestimate, and the fallout would be immediate and severe. The generals and Monroe reviewed every detail of the footage, noting not just the assault, but the culture it represented. Small gestures, whispered jokes, flippant attitudes, all signs that Bravo 6 tolerated disrespect. Barrett's face grew colder with each passing minute. "We're not just punishing one man," he said. "We're sending a message to every soldier here. Conduct, discipline, and respect are non-negotiable." Monroe, listening, realized that her role had changed. She was no longer simply a sergeant managing recruits. She had become a symbol of accountability, a living testament to the rules and standards the Army claimed to uphold. The men and women in that base would remember this moment for the rest of their careers, and she would ensure it was remembered correctly. Hours passed. Investigators swept through the base, interviewing recruits and officers, inspecting weapons, and reviewing logs. Harris was questioned repeatedly, each session revealing more about his arrogance, his lack of respect, and his inability to understand the consequences of his actions. Every explanation he offered fell flat. The generals and Monroe had already determined his fate. Meanwhile, Monroe sat quietly, blood-streaked and bruised, her gaze steady. She reflected on the years of subtle hostility she had endured. The jokes in the barracks, the rolling eyes during inspections, the way her orders were questioned, but never ignored when men were involved. She had survived everything until now, that is, when survival was no longer enough. This was accountability, swift and undeniable. By nightfall, the base was eerily quiet. The desert wind howled across the empty training yard, stirring clouds of dust in swirling patterns that mirrored the tension still alive in the air. Soldiers remained confined to their quarters. Harris sat in detention, and Monroe, finally free to rest, sat in the infirmary, reflecting on what had just transpired. The phone rang. It was Barrett. His voice, calm but firm, carried a single, undeniable message. "Sergeant Monroe, you've done more than defend yourself today. You've exposed systemic issues that have gone unaddressed for too long. Be prepared. Your report will trigger changes across every base, and your actions today will be remembered." Monroe exhaled slowly. The adrenaline of the day had begun to fade, leaving behind exhaustion, but also a sense of accomplishment. She had faced a man who thought his strength and arrogance were untouchable, and she had prevailed. The general's presence had amplified her authority, but it was her composure, skill, and resolve that had truly altered the course of events. Outside, the desert night stretched vast and silent, the stars piercing the sky like distant reminders of vigilance. Inside the base, lives had shifted. Recruits who had laughed, who had doubted her, who had underestimated the strength of discipline, would never forget the events of that day. Harris, once cocky and arrogant, would be a cautionary tale. And Monroe, bloody but unbroken, would begin the process of reshaping Bravo 6 into a base where respect, order, and discipline were not optional, they were required. By the time the infirmary doors closed and silence returned, the first seeds of change had already been planted. And Lisa Monroe, hardened by experience but steady as ever, knew this was only the beginning. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the Arizona desert in a burning orange glow, Bravo 6 had transformed from a typical training base into a fortress of tension. Soldiers moved silently in their quarters, their whispers swallowed by the walls. Harris remained in the holding cell, the weight of his actions settling like a stone in his stomach. He had always thrived on charm and physical intimidation, yet now, stripped of his authority and free will, he realized the full magnitude of underestimating someone like Lisa Monroe. Inside the command center, the atmosphere was tense and electrified. 3 generals, Barrett, Connors, and Harlan, stood over a bank of monitors, replaying footage from every camera in the training yard. Monroe sat nearby, her bloodied uniform patched and cleaned, her gaze steady, unflinching. The cameras revealed the assault from multiple angles. Harris's arrogance, the swing of his rifle stock, the exact moment Monroe's cheekbone absorbed the impact. Every detail was recorded, unambiguous, undeniable. Barrett's lips pressed into a thin line. He knew nothing, he muttered, and yet he acted as if rules didn't apply to him. This isn't just about him. This is systemic. Monroe's voice was measured, icy in its calm. Sir, this isn't a momentary lapse. The behavior we're seeing isn't isolated. Half the soldiers here treat orders and female officers as suggestions rather than mandates. Harris simply verbalized what others whisper. Connors, older and more pragmatic, nodded. I've seen the same in other bases, but nothing escalates like this so publicly. This is unprecedented. Harlan leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Unprecedented or overdue? Someone had to set the standard. And now Sergeant Monroe has done it. She's the catalyst. Monroe's hands rested on her lap, but her mind raced. She had spent years moving through male-dominated environments, enduring whispers, smirks, and subtle challenges. She had trained countless soldiers, enforced rules, and been underestimated at every turn. Yet today was different. Today, the rules of the Army had been violated in the most blatant way possible, and she had the evidence to ensure justice would be swift, uncompromising, and unassailable. Outside, the hum of activity intensified. Investigators combed through every corner of Bravo 6. Barracks were inspected, lockers forced open, digital records reviewed. Recruits were questioned one by one, the weight of accountability pressing down on them. Each soldier understood, in some gut-deep way, that the Army was watching. And Monroe, sitting among generals, was no longer just a sergeant. She was a symbol, the living embodiment of authority and discipline. Harris, meanwhile, sat in the holding area, his mind scrambling for explanations that didn't exist. He had acted recklessly, believing his strength and status would shield him from consequences. Now, surrounded by military police, and knowing the generals were actively reviewing his actions, he felt an unfamiliar panic. Every interaction, every sneer, every dismissive glance he had ever thrown at a female officer now returned to him tenfold. A door opened, and Barrett entered the holding room, his face unreadable. Harris straightened instinctively, trying to summon whatever arrogance he could. "Sir, I didn't." Barrett cut him off with a single, controlled motion. "You did. There is no ambiguity. You struck Sergeant Monroe deliberately. You humiliated the uniform. And now, you will face consequences not only for your actions today, but for the environment you've perpetuated." Harris's face paled. "Environment?" he repeated, incredulous. I didn't." Barrett leaned close, voice low but ice cold. "You thought she was just another officer to intimidate. She's the one writing the policies that determine conduct across every base. And now, thanks to you, her report will be more than words. It will be law." Back in the command center, Monroe continued reviewing footage with the generals. Each replay revealed subtle details. how recruits looked away when Harris first stepped out of line, how a few officers had hesitated to intervene, and how Monroe's calm composure had prevented the situation from escalating further. Every frame was evidence, every second a testament to her professionalism under pressure. Barrett's eyes softened slightly as he regarded her. "You have more control than anyone realizes," he said quietly, "and you exercised it with precision." Monroe simply nodded. She had no need for praise. The work wasn't over. The base was still fractured, discipline frayed, and the message had to be made crystal clear. Any hesitation now would undermine the very authority they were trying to enforce. Hours passed as the investigation intensified. Witness statements were collected, logs analyzed, and digital surveillance examined. Harris's network of excuses crumbled under scrutiny. His arrogance, once a protective armor, had become his undoing. The generals coordinated with the Pentagon to ensure every measure of accountability would be applied. Monroe's presence was central to the process, not only as the victim of the assault, but as the authority figure whose judgment would shape the outcome. By late evening, the tension in the command center reached its apex. Barrett finally broke the silence. "Prepare the orders," he said. "The base will be shut down until further notice. All personnel confined. Investigations completed. Harris will be separated from the Army, pending a full review. And Sergeant Monroe's report will initiate reforms immediately." Monroe's jaw tightened. The words carried finality. The base, once a place of predictable drills and hierarchy, would now be a symbol of change. The disruption would ripple outward, forcing soldiers across the military to reckon with the culture they had long tolerated. Meanwhile, Harris slumped in the holding area, his world collapsing. The arrogance that had carried him for years, the smug smiles and whispered intimidation, were gone. He understood, finally, that he had miscalculated, not only in underestimating Monroe, but in underestimating the system she represented. Outside, the desert wind howled, dust whipping across the empty training yard. The sun had disappeared, leaving the base bathed in an eerie twilight. Inside, Monroe's reflection in the monitors showed a calm, resolute figure, bloodied but unbroken. She had faced violence, disrespect, and systemic hostility, and had not faltered. The Army, the generals, and even Harris had witnessed her authority firsthand. Hours blurred into night as orders were transmitted across the base. Recruits were confined to quarters, communications monitored, and every officer reminded that rules were now non-negotiable. Harris's fate was sealed. Monroe's influence had been cemented. And yet, she knew this was only the beginning. Her mind replayed the day's events, the swing of Harris's rifle, the flash of pain, the rush of adrenaline, and the sudden arrival of generals. Every moment had tested her, and every moment had proven her resilience. She had emerged not only as a survivor, but as the agent of accountability the base desperately needed. As she finally left the command center, exhaustion hit her, but it was tempered by a deep sense of purpose. The desert night stretched endlessly ahead, filled with challenges and unknowns. Yet Monroe felt ready. The base had shifted, power dynamics realigned, and the first domino had fallen. Bravo 6 would never be the same. And somewhere deep within her, Monroe knew this was not just a story of one man's arrogance or one woman's resilience. It was the start of a transformation. The culture of the base, long tolerated, would now be exposed, examined, and rewritten. And she would ensure it was done with precision, authority, and uncompromising justice. The command center at Bravo 6 was alive with urgency. Fluorescent lights cast harsh reflections across the polished floor, illuminating the somber faces of officers and investigators crowded around screens and digital reports. Outside, the desert wind rattled window panes, a low, persistent howl that underscored the tension inside. Staff Sergeant Lisa Monroe, stood at the center, arms crossed, observing every movement with quiet authority. Blood still faintly stained her uniform, but she radiated calm and control, as if the earlier blow to her temple had never occurred. Generals Barrett, Connors, and Harlan paced slowly in the room, reviewing security footage from every angle of the yard. They watched Harris strike Monroe, the metal of the rifle stock glinting under the midday sun. The impact, the recoil, the subtle way Monroe's body absorbed the blow without faltering all were captured in stunning clarity. Harris's smugness had dissolved instantly, replaced by shock and disbelief. Barrett's expression remained stoic, but his voice carried the weight of command. He didn't just attack Sergeant Monroe. He exposed a culture of disrespect that's been tolerated for too long. This base, like many others, has allowed male officers to undermine authority with impunity. Today, we fix that. Monroe stepped forward. Sir, this is more than an isolated incident. Half the soldiers here exhibit similar behavior. Harris didn't just hit me. He verbalized what many of them think. This is systemic. If we stop at punishing him alone, we'll miss the opportunity to enforce long-term change. Connors nodded, leaning against the edge of a large monitor. I've been reviewing the base reports. Promotions given without merit, training corners cut, subtle harassment allowed to fester. This isn't just Harris. This base has been operating under the radar, and no one intervened until now. Harlan crossed his arms, eyes narrowing. Then we make sure they can't hide. Monroe will lead the review. Her assessment will dictate policy changes across every facility. Monroe inhaled sharply, but held her composure. She had always prepared for moments like this, but the weight of responsibility pressed heavily against her chest. Leading an investigation of this magnitude was more than she had ever faced. Yet, as she glanced around the room, she realized the generals weren't just trusting her. They were relying on her to restore order, discipline, and respect. Meanwhile, Harris sat in the holding cell, replaying the day's events over and over in his mind. Every second of arrogance, every condescending glance, every whisper of disdain aimed at female officers now haunted him. His career, once secure and promising, had collapsed in minutes. The reality was impossible to escape. The system he had disrespected was alive, precise, and now focused entirely on him. Sergeant Monroe, Barrett said, his tone cutting through the hum of activity, your assessment will determine more than one man's fate. Every report you produce, every observation you document, will ripple across the Army. Are you prepared for that responsibility? Monroe's eyes didn't waver. Sir, I've spent years documenting misconduct and ensuring accountability in male-dominated environments. This base will be no different. The reforms will be clear, enforceable, and immediate. Barrett nodded. Good, then let's begin. The next several hours were a whirlwind. Monroe, flanked by the generals, reviewed reports, interviewed recruits, and analyzed digital records. Each interaction highlighted the subtle patterns of abuse. Officers who disregarded orders, whispered insults, or undermined female leaders. Monroe documented each detail meticulously. Every statement mattered. Every piece of evidence contributed to a bigger picture. She knew that if even one instance went unrecorded, the credibility of the entire operation could be compromised. Outside the command center, the base had descended into a tense silence. Recruits were confined to their quarters, their movements monitored closely. Conversations were hushed, and the usual clamor of drills and training exercises was replaced by an uneasy stillness. The message was clear. Discipline, authority, and respect were no longer optional. Back in the holding cell, Harris's mental state deteriorated. He had been arrogant, reckless, and dismissive of authority, and now the consequences were tangible. Investigators had interrogated him multiple times, each session peeling away layers of excuses and lies. His story was unraveling, and with every passing hour, the full magnitude of his actions became unavoidable. Monroe reviewed a digital log of Harris's training history. Promotions had been granted despite repeated warnings. Minor incidents swept under the rug, and evaluations skewed in his favor. The more she read, the clearer it became. Harris was not an anomaly. He was the product of a system that had tolerated complacency, arrogance, and gender bias for far too long. The assault was a symptom, not the cause. Barrett spoke quietly, as if addressing Monroe personally. This is bigger than one man's mistake. This is an opportunity to reset the culture of this entire facility. Monroe nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. Then we start with transparency. All actions will be documented. All personnel interviewed. The changes will be impossible to ignore. Hours turned into night. The desert wind outside rose, sweeping dust across the yard, like silent witnesses to the transformation occurring inside. Monroe moved from room to room, interview by interview, her presence commanding attention. Recruits and officers alike found themselves forced to confront the consequences of their actions or their inaction. Some whispered apologies, others avoided eye contact, and a few stared openly at Monroe, realizing too late that the rules had shifted in ways they could not control. By midnight, preliminary findings were consolidated. Monroe's report outlined the assault, the base's systemic failures, and recommendations for immediate disciplinary measures. Harris's separation from the Army was already in motion, and broader reforms were being drafted to ensure that no officer could undermine authority with impunity. Barrett, reviewing the report, allowed a rare moment of approval to flicker across his stern face. "Sergeant Monroe," he said, his tone measured but approving, "your assessment is precise, thorough, and uncompromising. This will change Bravo 6 forever." Monroe felt a flicker of pride, but remained focused. "Sir, the work isn't done. Culture doesn't change overnight. Monitoring, reinforcement, and accountability must continue. We need to ensure these reforms are enforced daily, not just during inspections or crises." Connors added, "She's right. The challenge isn't just in documentation, it's in execution. Bravo 6 will be a model base, but only if every soldier internalizes the rules, not just follows them when watched." Harlan leaned back, folding his arms. "Then we have our plan. Begin immediate training reforms, implement stricter oversight, and remove anyone who resists. This base will lead by example." Meanwhile, Harris remained in the holding cell, the reality of his situation fully sinking in. Every detail of the assault, every whisper of misconduct he had thought harmless, was now documented and scrutinized. His career was over. The arrogance and entitlement that had defined him for years were now gone, replaced with fear, regret, and a bitter understanding of the consequences of underestimating Monroe. Monroe, watching the digital displays, felt a sense of grim satisfaction. The day had started with violence and disrespect, but had ended with accountability and clarity. She had faced physical aggression, systemic bias, and a culture that tolerated misconduct, and she had emerged not only unbroken, but as the central figure in reshaping Bravo 6. Outside, the desert night deepened, stars blazing above, distant and eternal. The wind carried a sense of change across the base, sweeping through empty barracks and quiet training fields. Every soldier confined to quarters felt it the knowledge that the rules had shifted, that authority and respect were no longer negotiable, and that one woman had changed everything. As Monroe finally returned to the infirmary to rest, her mind replayed the day's events, the swing of Harris's rifle, the impact, the calm arrival of the generals, and the painstaking process of review and reform. She was tired, yes, but also resolute. The transformation had begun, and she would see it through to completion. By the end of the night, Bravo 6 was no longer the same. A storm had passed through, and in its wake, order, discipline, and accountability had been restored. Harris's arrogance was gone, replaced by consequences he could not escape. The base's culture had shifted, and Monroe had proven that one person with integrity, authority, and courage could alter the course of an entire institution. And deep in her chest, Monroe knew this was only the beginning. The reforms, the oversight, the accountability, they were just the first steps. The challenge of changing entrenched culture would continue. But now the message was clear. Disrespect would no longer be tolerated, and authority, when exercised with precision and fairness, would always prevail. The following morning, the desert air at Bravo 6 felt heavy, almost oppressive, as if the base itself were holding its breath. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft hum of air conditioning units and distant footsteps of military police patrolling the perimeter. Inside the holding facility, Harris sat hunched over, hands cuffed, a knot of fear and disbelief tightening in his chest. He had spent years relying on charm, physical presence, and a subtle undercurrent of intimidation to navigate the military hierarchy, but now all of that had evaporated. His career, his reputation, and even his sense of self-preservation were slipping through his fingers. The door clanged open, and Barrett entered, flanked by Monroe and Colonel Raines. Harris looked up, trying to summon the arrogance he had relied on for so long, but it failed him. Every ounce of confidence had been stripped away. Barrett's eyes bore into him, steady and unwavering. "Corporal Harris," Barrett said, voice precise and controlled, "you assaulted a superior officer. You undermined the uniform. You acted recklessly in front of witnesses. Your actions have consequences far beyond what you can imagine." Harris swallowed hard, trying to speak. "Sir, I didn't mean," Barrett cut him off with a single, sharp glance. "Intent is irrelevant. You struck Staff Sergeant Monroe, a federal inspector embedded in this base to enforce standards. You disrespected the uniform, the chain of command, and every officer who follows the rules. Today, your career ends." Harris's hands trembled in the cuffs. "No, sir. Please, Monroe stepped forward, her calm, steady presence filling the room. "He believed I was just another soldier," she said, voice quiet but cutting. "He didn't realize who I am, or what my role entails. He underestimated the consequences of his arrogance. And now he will learn them." Barrett nodded once. Effective immediately, Harris is suspended pending a full administrative separation. His actions will be documented in the Army's personnel files. All privileges revoked. Access to the base restricted. And let it be known, any attempt to interfere or manipulate the process will be met with disciplinary action. The severity of the consequences hit Harris like a hammer. Panic replaced disbelief. He had no allies, no loopholes, and no fallback. Every moment of arrogance, every whispered insult toward female officers, every corner cut in training had converged into this one inescapable reality. Monroe's eyes met his, calm and unyielding, and Harris understood fully that he had miscalculated entirely. Meanwhile, across the base, Monroe's influence was spreading. Investigators, carrying detailed logs and footage, moved through the barracks, ensuring every recruit understood the gravity of the situation. Phones were inspected, lockers searched, and interviews conducted. Every soldier confronted their behavior, both past and present, realizing that accountability was no longer optional. The murmurs and whispers that had once permeated the base half-jokes, subtle slights, offhand comments, were silenced under the weight of observation. In the command center, Monroe reviewed reports with Barrett, Connors, and Harlan. Every interview, every file, every piece of evidence painted a stark picture of Bravo 6's systemic issues. Promotions given without merit, repeated minor incidents covered up, harassment tolerated. The assault was a symptom of a deeper culture of complacency and disrespect. Monroe's recommendations were precise: strict oversight, immediate disciplinary action for any violations, mandatory retraining, and implementation of policies ensuring gender equality and professional conduct. Barrett leaned back in his chair, letting the silence hang in the room for a moment. "This isn't just about Harris," he said finally. "This is about the culture that allowed him to believe his actions were acceptable. We need to make sure the entire Army understands the consequences of such behavior." Monroe nodded. "Sir, the reforms must be enforceable, measurable, and continuous. Otherwise, this will become another moment that fades into memory, rather than a turning point." Connors added, "The recruits need to see that rules apply to everyone, regardless of rank, gender, or reputation. The impact of this incident must be lasting." Outside, the base's once bustling training yard was eerily empty. Recruits remained confined to quarters, under supervision, but the atmosphere was electric with tension. Everyone understood the implications. Authority had been challenged, but it had been restored. And the person responsible for that restoration was Monroe. By mid-afternoon, Harris was formally escorted to the administrative office to process his separation. The procession was symbolic. He walked through the same hallways where he had once wielded influence and intimidation, now powerless, observed by recruits and officers alike. Every glance, every whisper reinforced the gravity of his actions and the cost of underestimating Monroe. Monroe returned to the command center to continue reviewing her report. The generals had tasked her with consolidating evidence, drafting policy recommendations, and overseeing the enforcement of discipline across the base. The work was exhausting, but every file she reviewed, every interview she conducted, strengthened her resolve. She realized that accountability wasn't just punitive, was transformative. Soldiers, officers, and the entire base were learning, witnessing firsthand, the consequences of failing to uphold standards. By evening, news of the incident began to spread beyond the base. Military channels buzzed with the story of Bravo 6, highlighting the assault, the lockdown, and Monroe's role in enforcing accountability. Internally, the base had already shifted. Recruits who had once smirked at authority now walked with measured discipline. Officers who had tolerated subtle misconduct understood that oversight was now strict, observable, and unwavering. Monroe's presence, her authority, and the backing of Generals Barrett, Connors, and Harlan had sent an unmistakable message. Respect was mandatory. In her quarters that night, Monroe reflected on the day. The gash on her temple still throbbed faintly, a physical reminder of what she had endured, but it was insignificant compared to the larger battle. She had faced arrogance, physical assault, and systemic indifference, and emerged as the central figure in reshaping Bravo 6. She realized that the fight for respect and accountability extended beyond her own experience. It was about every soldier who had ever been dismissed, underestimated, or silenced. Harris, meanwhile, sat alone in a processing room, the weight of consequences pressing down with unbearable force. His arrogance, his entitlement, and his disdain for rules and female officers had led him here, and there was no path forward. Every moment of his past behavior was now documented, scrutinized, and used as evidence in proceedings that would permanently alter his career and reputation. Monroe's report, once finalized, would trigger changes across multiple Army bases, implementing reforms that ensured no officer could evade accountability, no matter their rank or connections. She was no longer just a sergeant. She had become symbol, the embodiment of authority and integrity in a system that often tolerated complacency and disrespect. By nightfall, the base was quiet. Soldiers rested in their quarters, officers reviewed new procedures, and investigators completed final checks. The desert wind swept across the training yard, carrying away the day's tension, but leaving behind an indelible impression. Bravo to 6 had changed. Authority had been restored, arrogance punished, and a culture of accountability seated for the first time. As Monroe prepared for a brief rest, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The events of the day had been traumatic, yes, but also pivotal. Harris had been confronted, his arrogance dismantled, and his career ended. The base, once tolerant of subtle misconduct, now operated under the strict watch of oversight and reform. And Monroe, standing firm despite injury and challenge, had become a catalyst for lasting change. She knew this was only the beginning. The process of transforming a culture, even one as rigid and hierarchical as the military, was ongoing. But tonight, at least, Bravo 6 had witnessed the power of integrity, the necessity of accountability, and the indomitable strength of a single soldier unwilling to be underestimated. And somewhere in the desert night, as stars glittered overhead, Monroe allowed herself a small but determined smile. The fight for justice, respect, and transformation had begun, and she was ready to see it through. The next morning, the desert sun rose over Bravo 6 with an intensity that mirrored the urgency inside the base. Staff Sergeant Lisa Monroe stood in the command center, the morning light reflecting off the polished screens and metal surfaces. The wound on her temple, still tender, had been bandaged, but the physical pain was minor compared to the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Today, she would begin implementing reforms that would transform the culture of Bravo 6 and potentially set a precedent for military bases across the country. Generals Barrett, Connors, and Harlan were already present, discussing the strategy with Monroe. The command center hummed with controlled energy, officers and investigators moving with purpose around them. Barrett's voice was steady, commanding attention. Sergeant Monroe, the preliminary assessment is complete. Now we transition from documentation to action. You will oversee the reforms, ensure compliance, and report directly to the Pentagon. This is a rare opportunity for someone of your rank, and I trust you understand the gravity. Monroe's jaw tightened. Yes, sir. I understand. These reforms must be enforceable, visible, and continuous. Otherwise, the culture that produced Harris will persist. Connors interjected, leaning against a console. Some officers may resist. Change is difficult, even when it's necessary. You must be prepared for opposition from both recruits and leadership. Harlan added, we've secured support at the highest levels. Barrett's presence ensures compliance for now, but the long-term success will depend on your leadership. Monroe nodded. She had spent years navigating environments that undervalued women in positions of authority. She knew how to read tension, anticipate resistance, and assert control without escalation. The challenge wasn't new, but the stakes were higher than ever. The first task was immediate personnel retraining. Monroe drafted a schedule that prioritized officers and senior recruits, ensuring they understood the expectations for conduct, chain of command respect, and gender equality. Workshops would combine practical drills, scenario-based training, and discussions on ethics and accountability. Every participant would be held accountable for their actions and their influence on the unit's culture. Outside the command center, investigators escorted recruits to the training halls. The desert wind carried dust in swirling patterns, a symbolic reflection of the upheaval within the base. Soldiers who had once been cavalier or dismissive now moved with a new awareness, every step measured, every glance cautious. The impact of Monroe's authority was already evident. Whispers of her influence rippled through the barracks, spreading like wildfire. Harris remained confined, processing the weight of the consequences he faced. The administrative separation was underway, and every moment brought a new layer of realization. He had underestimated Monroe, underestimated the system, and underestimated the consequences of arrogance. Each report, Each interview conducted by Monroe and the generals reinforced the inevitability of his downfall. Meanwhile, Monroe met with Barrett and Raines to review the base's systemic issues. Reports detailed repeated misconduct, lax enforcement of rules, and subtle gender biases that had persisted for years. Monroe's recommendations were precise: zero tolerance for harassment, consistent enforcement of regulations, immediate disciplinary action for violations, and ongoing monitoring of all personnel. These policies would be written into the base's operational handbook, ensuring they were enforceable and enduring. Barrett studied the documents, nodding slowly. "Your approach is comprehensive, Sergeant, but implementing it will require political tact as much as authority. You'll face resistance, yes, but also scrutiny. The Pentagon will be watching closely." Monroe's eyes narrowed. "I'm prepared for that, sir. The reforms aren't negotiable. Respect and accountability aren't optional. If anyone resists, they will be removed. The message must be clear." Connors added, "Some senior officers may feel threatened. They've grown accustomed to operating without scrutiny. You need to assert authority without alienating them completely." Monroe considered this. Leadership wasn't only about enforcing rules, it was about navigating human psychology, understanding motivations, and projecting authority in a way that commanded respect without provoking rebellion. She had spent years doing exactly that, and now the challenge was magnified exponentially. By midday, Monroe began implementing the first wave of reforms. Officers gathered in the central training hall, their expressions wary. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly unused to being addressed with such authority by a woman of Monroe's rank. She did not hesitate. "Good morning," Monroe began, her voice calm but resonant, commanding silence. "You are here because the culture at Bravo 6 has tolerated misconduct, disrespect, and negligence. That culture ends today. Every action you take, every order you give, and every interaction you have will be observed, documented, and held to the highest standard. Failure to comply will result in disciplinary action, up to and including separation from the Army. There will be no exceptions." Murmurs rippled through the hall. Some officers exchanged nervous glances. Others stiffened in defiance. Monroe ignored them, her focus on clarity and precision. "We are instituting a zero-tolerance policy for harassment, insubordination, and discrimination. Training will be mandatory, and your adherence will be monitored continuously. Reforms will be written into our operational handbook and enforced daily. This is not a suggestion. This is the standard for Bravo 6, effective immediately." Across the room, senior officers who had previously questioned her authority now sat in tense silence. The message was unmistakable. Monroe was not only in control, she was the instrument of change, and resistance would have consequences. Later, Monroe convened a smaller group of officers in the command center to address potential points of friction. "Some of you may feel challenged by these reforms," she said, her tone firm but measured. "That is normal. But understand this: the reforms are not negotiable, and neither is respect. If you are unwilling to uphold standards, the Army has no place for you. Leadership is earned through discipline, integrity, and respect, nothing else." The meeting was tense, but effective. Monroe's composure, combined with the visible backing of the generals, left no room for ambiguity. Officers understood that the hierarchy had shifted. Monroe's authority was absolute within this context, and the reforms she championed would be enforced without exception. Meanwhile, Harris's separation had been finalized. His name would be removed from personnel records, his rank revoked, and his career permanently altered. He had become a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when arrogance meets accountability. News of his dismissal had begun circulating quietly within the base, reinforcing Monroe's authority and the seriousness of the reforms. As the day ended, Monroe reviewed her notes in the quiet of the command center. The wind outside swept across the desert, scattering dust and carrying the faint sounds of recruits moving in formation under strict supervision. For the first time in weeks, the base felt orderly, but more importantly, it felt disciplined. Respect had been restored, arrogance punished, and accountability established as a non-negotiable standard. Barrett entered the room, his expression faintly approving. "Sergeant Monroe, your approach is working. Already, compliance is higher and morale is shifting. The base is beginning to internalize the reforms rather than just follow them under observation." Monroe allowed herself a small, measured smile. "Sir, the work isn't complete, but the foundation is solid. Accountability, respect, and discipline are now central to every action taken at Bravo 6. Connors added, "The real test will come in the weeks ahead. Patterns of misconduct can resurface if vigilance lapses. But with Monroe leading, the likelihood of long-term success is high." Harlan nodded. "We will continue to monitor, but this is a turning point. Bravo 6 will become a model base, thanks to her leadership." Monroe leaned back slightly, exhausted but resolute. The day had been long, challenging, and mentally taxing, but it had been transformative. Harris's arrogance had been confronted, the base's culture disrupted, and the groundwork laid for lasting reform. She understood that true leadership required persistence, patience, and unwavering authority, and she possessed all three. As night fell over the desert, Monroe stepped outside briefly, letting the cool air wash over her. The stars glittered above, distant but constant, and the desert wind whispered across the base. Bravo 6 was no longer a place where misconduct could flourish unchecked. Authority had been reinforced, respect restored, and Monroe had emerged as the pivotal force driving systemic change. And deep inside, Monroe knew this was only the beginning. The Army as a whole would feel the ripple effects of Bravo 6's transformation. The challenge of enforcing long-term reform would continue, but now the standard had been set. Monroe had not only survived adversity, she had turned it into opportunity, reshaping the culture of a base and solidifying her role as a leader no one could underestimate. By the third day after Harris's removal, Bravo 6 had transformed into a base under intense scrutiny. The desert heat blazed relentlessly, but inside the command center, the tension was palpable. Staff Sergeant Lisa Monroe moved through the rows of officers and recruits with quiet authority, reviewing reports, approving changes, and ensuring the reforms were implemented exactly as intended. Every detail mattered: schedules, accountability logs, updated training materials, and officer compliance checks. Nothing could be overlooked. The phone rang sharply, interrupting the hum of activity. Monroe answered, her voice steady. Monroe speaking. On the other end was a representative from the Pentagon. They had received preliminary reports of the incident, and now Washington wanted details, full documentation of the assault, the subsequent investigations, and the reforms being implemented. The political stakes had suddenly escalated. Barrett's voice cut in behind her. "Sergeant, this is expected. When a base as prominent as Bravo 6 faces systemic issues, it draws attention. Be precise, detailed, and professional. The Pentagon will scrutinize every word." Monroe nodded. "Understood, sir." She knew that beyond the immediate task of reforming the base, she was now navigating a political landscape. Her credibility, her authority, and the outcomes of her actions would be analyzed by officials far removed from the desert sands of Arizona. Every decision mattered. Minutes later, a military liaison arrived at the base with a camera crew and reporters from internal defense channels. Monroe led them through the command center, explaining the reforms, the oversight processes, and the personnel retraining programs. Officers and recruits moved in precise formations, their actions observed and corrected in real time. Every drill, Every correction, every procedural adjustment was an illustration of discipline restored. Barrett spoke to the assembled media, his voice authoritative. The incident at Bravo 6 demonstrated the consequences of misconduct and disrespect within the ranks. Thanks to the leadership of Staff Sergeant Lisa Monroe, reforms have been implemented to ensure accountability, discipline, and respect for every soldier, regardless of gender or rank. Monroe answered questions with clarity and composure. She explained that zero-tolerance policies had been instituted, that officers were being retrained, and that disciplinary actions were ongoing. She emphasized that the reforms were designed to be measurable, enforceable, and continuous, ensuring lasting cultural change. Every statement reinforced her authority while highlighting the seriousness of the changes. Outside, recruits practiced drills with renewed precision, every movement demonstrating the effects of Monroe's oversight. Officers monitored performance closely, correcting errors immediately. Even the smallest slip and improper salute, a delayed response, or a flippant remark was addressed. The base had become a controlled environment, a laboratory for restoring discipline and accountability. Harris, now fully separated from the Army, had become a cautionary tale whispered across the barracks. His arrogance, once tolerated or ignored, had led to irreversible consequences. New recruits were briefed about the incident as part of ethics and accountability training. Monroe's story became both a warning and a model of resilience, her authority unquestioned, her integrity visible to every observer. By afternoon, Monroe received a call from a Pentagon liaison requesting a detailed briefing. She assembled all evidence, security footage, personnel reports, interview transcripts, and her own observations. The presentation was precise, professional, and unflinching. Every systemic failure was documented, every corrective action noted, every officer's compliance accounted for. The reforms were presented as a replicable model for other bases facing similar challenges. The briefing was intense. Officials questioned details, challenged assumptions, and requested clarifications. Monroe answered calmly, citing specific examples, offering data-backed recommendations, and demonstrating a complete understanding of both the personnel and organizational dynamics. She projected confidence and authority, leaving no room for doubt. Barrett watched silently, a faint smile breaking his usually stern expression. Monroe had navigated not only the immediate crisis, but also the political scrutiny that accompanied it. She had ensured that Bravo 6's reforms were both effective and defensible at the highest levels. Back at the base, Monroe implemented additional measures. Officers were required to submit daily conduct logs, documenting interactions with recruits and peers. Recruits were encouraged to report any misconduct or harassment through an anonymous system. Regular inspections and surprise audits were scheduled to ensure ongoing compliance. The emphasis was clear. Accountability was constant, comprehensive, and uncompromising. Monroe also established mentoring programs to support recruits and junior officers. These sessions addressed leadership, ethics, communication, and respect, reinforcing the values the base now embodied. She personally attended the first sessions, emphasizing the importance of integrity, vigilance, and accountability. Her presence was a tangible demonstration of leadership, authority, and experience. By evening, news of the reforms had begun reaching wider audiences. Military journals, internal newsletters, and news outlets highlighted the unprecedented nature of Monroe's leadership. She was depicted not just as a survivor of assault, but as a transformative figure, reshaping military culture at one of its most prominent bases. Her story became a symbol of resilience, professionalism, and decisive leadership in the face of systemic failure. Monroe's influence extended beyond immediate reforms. Officers and recruits began adjusting their behavior, understanding that discipline, respect, and accountability were non-negotiable. Subtle gestures of defiance or arrogance vanished almost overnight. The base, once marked by subtle hostility and lax oversight, now operated as a model of order and professionalism. Yet Monroe remained vigilant. She knew cultural change was never instantaneous. Systems could revert, individuals could resist, and oversight could weaken over time. To prevent this, she instituted monthly evaluations, ongoing training, and continuous review of personnel conduct. Every officer and recruit would be held accountable, not just for their actions, but for their influence on the culture of the base. Harris's absence became a constant reminder of consequences. Even officers who had previously tolerated minor misconduct were now acutely aware that arrogance, disrespect, and insubordination had real, tangible outcomes. The message was clear. Standards applied to everyone, without exception, and leadership required vigilance, integrity, and respect. As night fell, Monroe walked along the perimeter of the base. The desert stretched endlessly, illuminated by a crescent moon. The wind carried a faint chill, scattering dust across the empty training yards. Below her, soldiers moved in disciplined formations. Officers monitored every detail, and the base operated as a cohesive, highly controlled unit. Every element reflected the transformation she had instigated. She paused, reflecting on the journey from the assault to this moment. Harris had acted recklessly, underestimating her resolve and the authority of the system. The generals had provided support, but it was her leadership, composure, and strategic thinking that had catalyzed change. The base had been reshaped, culture restored, and authority reinforced. Barrett's words echoed in her mind. Bravo 6 will become a model base, thanks to her leadership. Monroe knew the road ahead would be challenging. Oversight, reform, and cultural change were ongoing processes, and she would remain at the center, ensuring that the foundation she had built was maintained. In the quiet of the desert night, Monroe understood the significance of her role. She had turned adversity into opportunity, transforming a moment of personal violence into a systemic victory. The Army had witnessed not only the consequences of misconduct, but also the power of resilience, authority, and strategic leadership. The story of Bravo 6 would ripple beyond the desert. Officers at other bases would take notice. Commanders would reconsider tolerance of misconduct. Recruits and junior officers would internalize the lessons of accountability. And Monroe, once underestimated and dismissed, had become a symbol of what leadership, integrity, and courage could achieve. As she returned to the command center for a final review, Monroe felt a quiet satisfaction. The reforms were in motion, the culture had shifted, and the consequences for Harris, and anyone who might follow in his path, were clear and undeniable. The base had transformed, not through coercion alone, but through deliberate, precise, and unwavering leadership. And deep in her chest, Monroe knew this was only the beginning. The journey toward lasting change had begun, and she would ensure that Bravo 6 remained a model of accountability, respect, and disciplined excellence for years to come. Weeks had passed since the assault that had ignited a chain of events transforming Bravo to 6. The desert sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the once chaotic training yard. Staff Sergeant Lisa Monroe walked through the base, now a model of order and discipline. Recruits moved in precise formations. Officers monitored drills with careful attention, and the atmosphere was one of professional intensity. The reforms she had implemented were not temporary. They were becoming ingrained in the daily routines, habits, and mindset of everyone on the base. The change was palpable. Morning drills ran flawlessly, every salute crisp, every command executed without hesitation. Officers who had previously tolerated misconduct now enforced rules rigorously, often citing Monroe's directives as precedent. Even minor infractions were addressed immediately. The culture had shifted, not by fear alone, but through the visible, uncompromising presence of leadership that demanded accountability, respect, and integrity. Monroe's influence extended beyond Bravo 6. The Pentagon had formally reviewed her reports, endorsing the reforms and recommending their implementation at other bases. News of the incident, Harris's consequences, and Monroe's leadership circulated through military channels. Defense journals praised her decisiveness, resilience, and strategic thinking. She was no longer merely a sergeant who survived an assault. She had become a symbol of accountability and professionalism across the Army. Generals Barrett, Connors, and Harlan convened in the command center with Monroe to assess the long-term impact of the reforms. Barrett spoke first, his voice steady. "Sergeant Monroe, the changes you've implemented are producing measurable results. Bravo 6 is no longer a base where misconduct goes unchecked. The Pentagon is considering replicating these reforms nationwide. Your leadership has set a precedent." Monroe nodded, her posture firm. "Sir, the base still requires monitoring, but the foundation is solid. Officers and recruits now understand the consequences of their actions, and the culture is shifting toward consistent accountability." Connors added, "It's not just about discipline, it's about instilling respect, professionalism, and vigilance. This is what the Army needs, especially in challenging environments where authority is often tested." Harlan smiled faintly. "You've done more than correct one incident. You've changed the trajectory of an entire institution." "That doesn't happen often, Sergeant." Monroe allowed herself a small, measured smile, though she remained focused. Her work was far from complete, but this moment of recognition affirmed that her efforts were making a lasting impact. Meanwhile, Harris had been formally discharged. His name was now a permanent cautionary tale, cited in training materials and ethics discussions. Recruits were briefed on his misconduct and consequences as part of leadership and accountability programs. The story of his arrogance, the assault, and Monroe's response became an educational tool, a stark reminder that disrespect and misconduct would not be tolerated. Back on the base, Monroe conducted a final review of all personnel. Every officer had submitted compliance reports, attended retraining sessions, and documented their oversight of recruits. Monthly audits were scheduled to ensure continuity, and Monroe personally supervised the first round of follow-up evaluations. The system was now self-reinforcing, with accountability embedded at every level. The changes had an unexpected effect. Morale improved. Recruits and officers alike felt clarity in expectations and confidence that leadership was consistent and fair. Trust in the chain of command, previously undermined by neglect and harassment, began to solidify. Monroe had demonstrated that discipline and respect were not mutually exclusive with competence. Empathy or morale, they were foundational to both. One afternoon, Monroe received a call from a Pentagon liaison requesting a briefing on the broader applicability of her reforms. She assembled detailed reports, including interviews, compliance logs, and procedural updates. The presentation emphasized not just policy, but measurable outcomes, cultural shifts, and personnel development. Monroe highlighted that lasting reform required continuous oversight, transparency, and a willingness to confront systemic bias wherever it existed. The briefing was intense, with senior officials asking pointed questions, challenging assumptions, and scrutinizing every recommendation. Monroe answered calmly, citing evidence, explaining processes, and demonstrating a clear understanding of both personnel dynamics and organizational structure. Her authority was unquestionable, her vision precise. By the conclusion of the session, the officials were convinced that her model could and should be implemented across other bases to prevent future incidents like Harris's. Back at Bravo 6, the base buzzed with renewed purpose. Recruits ran obstacle courses with precision. Officers monitored compliance meticulously, and every corner of the facility reflected Monroe's influence. Even small actions saluting correctly, maintaining uniform standards, following procedural directives, were now embedded as non-negotiable habits. The desert wind swept across the yard, carrying dust and echoes of a base fundamentally changed. Monroe walked along the perimeter at sunset, reflecting on the journey. From the assault that had left her bloodied but resolute, to the support of Generals Barrett, Connors, and Harlan, to the transformation of every officer and recruit. She had turned adversity into systemic reform. Her leadership had reshaped Bravo 6, not just as a base, but as a model for the Army. She paused, watching the silhouettes of recruits running drills against the fiery sky. Every movement reflected discipline, respect, and precision. The once toxic culture of complacency, arrogance, and subtle harassment had been replaced with accountability, integrity, and vigilance. Monroe understood that the change would require continued effort, but the foundation was now unshakable. Later that evening, Monroe convened a final assembly in the main training hall. Officers and recruits gathered, a sense of anticipation and pride in the air. Monroe addressed them with calm authority. "The past few weeks have tested this base," she began, her voice resonating across the hall. "We faced misconduct, disrespect, and systemic challenges. But together, we have transformed Bravo 6 into a model of discipline, accountability, and professionalism. Every action you take from this point forward reflects not just on you, but on the integrity of this base and the Army as a whole. Respect, vigilance, and leadership are not optional. They are your responsibility." The room was silent, every soldier attentive. Monroe continued, "Harris's actions were a wake-up call, but it was our response that defines us. We chose accountability. We chose reform. And now, Bravo 6 is stronger, disciplined, and ready for any challenge." Barrett stepped forward, placing a hand lightly on Monroe's shoulder. "Sergeant Monroe, your leadership has restored order, discipline, and honor to this base. Bravo 6 will serve as an example for the entire Army. Your courage, integrity, and decisiveness have changed the trajectory of countless lives." Monroe allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. She had endured pain, resistance, and scrutiny, but she had prevailed. Her work had transformed a base, reshaped a culture, and established a legacy of accountability. As night fell, Monroe walked through the now quiet base. The desert stretched endlessly, illuminated by moonlight. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of dust and the distant echo of soldiers practicing drills. For the first time in weeks, the base felt calm, disciplined, and united. Authority had been restored. Respect had been enforced. And Monroe had emerged not only as a survivor, but as a leader whose influence would endure. The story of Bravo 6 and of Harris's downfall, Monroe's resilience, and the systemic reforms she implemented would ripple far beyond the desert. Across bases nationwide, officers and recruits would take notice, and the model she had established would guide future leadership, training, and accountability programs. Monroe paused one last time, looking at the stars glittering above. She knew the work of leadership never truly ended, but the foundation was secure. Bravo 6 had transformed from a place of chaos and tolerance and misconduct into a symbol of discipline, integrity, and unwavering authority. And deep within, Monroe understood the truth she had proven to herself, to the Army, and to the generations of soldiers who would follow. Adversity could be transformed into opportunity. Misconduct could be confronted with precision. And a single leader, guided by integrity and courage, could reshape an entire institution. The desert was silent, the base calm, and Monroe's legacy established. Bravo 6 would never be the same again.